And now on to the next part of our investigations of conceptual art. We will be moving to Colombia. Take a minute to look at this piece. You're seeing a close-up on the left and an installation in the broader image in the background. It's from an exhibition by Doris Salcedo at the Pulitzer Gallery. Doris Salcedo, as you may have guessed, is a Colombian artist. And like the other conceptual artists we have examined so far, she's using the breakdown of language as part of the medium of her work. Let's see how that plays out. Like Chile, Colombia has been in a ongoing state of civil war up to the point of Salcedo's work. Moving between the right and the left, who became absolutely polarized and vicious with one another and vicious with the population, militarized and heartless. We move into an era when you may recognize the figure on the right. If you have watched Narcos, you've gotten to the section on Colombia, you'll visually recognize him. And then, of course, the banner in the back lets you know exactly who it is. We have Pablo Escobar, who's running for a state seat. Escobar, as you know, is a major drug lord, a leader of the Colombian preeminent drug cartel. And it's worth it to watch Narcos. Of course, this is, a Hollywood reenactment, but it does give you a glimpse into that world, into the power of the cartels over not only daily life, but also political life. In the midst of these wars between parties, and then the escalation, absolute escalation of violence induced by Escobar and the Cali cartels, there is a dramatic loss of life in Colombia. And we see in the work of Salcedo a very poignant way of dealing with this. You may recognize that we're dealing somehow in this work with shoes. And then this other material, right, kind of membrane. It is, in fact, an animal membrane, something like skin, very, very thin biological material that's been wrapped around the shoes on the left and sutured and stitched. And then you see this image on the right. What she's done in the Pulitzer Gallery is make niches in the walls where these shoes are enclosed. And then that membrane is sewn into the wall. You can see the stitches outlining it in red on the right. What's she up to? How does the work make you feel? The project itself is called Atribularios, and it was based on the experience of people who went missing. When a beloved person disappears, everything becomes impregnated with that person's presence. Every single object, but also every space, is a reminder of his or her absence, their absence. As if absence were stronger than presence in the face of that loss. There isn't a single area of one's life left untainted by sorrow. And this is Dora Salcedo's quote. And she says, "What I did was almost a literal transposition of the victims' families' feelings into real space. Furthermore, it was vital to construct the work in spatial terms, to act as a meeting point for those of us who have lived through such ordeals. The experience had to be taken to a collective space, away from the anonymity of private experience." What Salcedo is dealing with is this intense personal loss, grief, and pain. But because of the conditions in Colombia, it wasn't just one family. It wasn't just one friend's loss that she was documenting. She's documenting loss on a huge scale. To create the works, Salcedo collected shoes, shirts, pieces of clothing from those whose lives had been lost in the Civil War in Colombia and in the drug violence. In addition to those shoe projects, she created the sculptures that we see on the left. What's going on in those sculptures? The photo on the right is a close-up of the image on the left. So on a basic level, right, we're working somehow with a door. You've got this tall, narrow door. But as we can see from the image of the right, then there's something of is it a chair? Is it a bench? Is it a stool? It's been inserted somehow. It's formed this awkward, eerie conjunction with the door itself. And then you have this piece of material, this fabric that we see on the far right image in detail. Kind of a lace, perhaps women's clothing. And then this kind of mess on the furniture, right? This almost violent looking splatter. And in detail and up close, we would see that it's concrete, where she's covered and filled in broken spaces. What happens with these pieces of furniture, these pieces of home, is that they themselves become tortured. They're out of place. There's this awkwardness, this disconnect, this unhomely feeling in looking at them. And she's trying again to echo that feeling of displacement. And also the way that common spaces, homes, restaurants, schools, libraries, courthouses, things where, the furniture should have felt familiar, could be turned on its head and used for torture, used for violent ends. We see that here. What we're looking at is a cupboard. You can see the way that the lace in front is pushing through up against the glass. You see that in those white flowers that appear. It's probably curtains inside of a cabinet. And then on the left, maybe folded clothing, someone's folded shirts. Absolutely surrounded by concrete. Spaces that would have had air, would have had life, reminders of people and home and daily comforts. Suffocatingly filled with concrete and rebar. It gives the piece such a heaviness. It gives you this feeling of the emotional weight of loss. For the Istanbul Biennial in 2003, Salcedo created this piece. Again, remembering those who are gone. She's documenting a precise set of losses through a precise number of chairs. And at the same time, right, she's filling the gap between two buildings. This is a street scene. You see the man walking by. This idea of memorialization, of remembrance. Beautiful in its massing, provocative, evocative of the people who will no longer come home, sit down at the table. One of Salcedo's most well-known pieces occurs at the National Palace in Colombia. You're seeing here where Escobar, after not making the presidency in the way that he wanted to be elected, instead storms the National Palace in fury with tanks, with armed people, armed men. When he did so, he took hostages and people were killed inside. Until the number reaches the number who died there in that takeover. Again, this somber, almost dance-like performance, not of bodies this time, but of chairs. A way of interacting in public space, a way of speaking where words fail. It's a conceptual piece, right? It's the idea here that's generating the work. The idea of loss, the idea of remembrance, the idea of the people who would sit in basically Parliament or Congress in those chairs who were killed. Salcedo's work is heavy, it's poignant. It works on a political, emotional, and of course, a conceptual level. I had the privilege to see this show when it was in New York of Salcedo's work at the Met. Again, that use of furniture, you feel in this gallery spaces, if you've walked into a room that's been cleaned, you know, the tables have been turned upside down in order for the floor to be cleaned, you feel poignantly the absence of students or people who would be there. And at the same time, as you can see popping up in this image, there are those strands of green grass. And you can see that grass in more detail here. Growing up through what you can now see is this bizarre stacking of tables. The stacking below, or a table sitting below with a heavy, thick mud layer in between. And growing up from that mud is the grass itself. There's something eerily familiar in the shape of the tables, right? As if they were burial spaces. That mud layer in between reinforces that idea, and you get the explicit feeling of suffocation between those tables. And at the same time, there's this spark of bright hope in the work, as out of that dirt, out of that death, out of that decay, life pushes forward. It pushes to grow and to thrive where before there was no hope. no possibility. Now there's life. Green grass coming up through the dark spaces. In 2007, Salcedo created this work at the Tate Modern. This is a internationally known museum in London. And as you can see from the architecture on the right, super modern, very austere in its, gorgeous museum quality. It's a building that's meant to be admired. And here in this building meant to be admired, Salcedo was invited to create an installation. And the installation that she created was to put a gaping crack into the concrete floor. It's called shibboleth, like the rending of the earth. And Salcedo talks about it in the next clip that I'll share with you. Be sure to watch it after you see the rest of this section. And this has been a difficult lecture. We're looking at conceptual art and the way that it's pushing back against dictatorship, state-sponsored terror, and brutality. So I want to end on an optimistic note. Have any of you seen images of this teeter-totter wall? It's a project that occurred at the US-Mexico border in 2017. It's a political project, it's an architectural project, and it's a very playful project. Two architects, Rael and Sanfratello from Berkeley, were trying to think about border walls as architectural space along the lines of even architectural violence. And they wanted to push back on the idea of its formidable, permanent nature. They wanted to show the way that borders are always permeable. They're never the boundaries that we imagine them to be. And so they created this series of teeter-totters, which you can see here. We have kids on one side of the wall teetering. And as you can see from the graphic they set up on the other side, we have them tottering. And for 40 minutes, this wall, this thing that is set up to be a division, to be a blockade between neighbors, became a toy, became a playground. The art here is the idea of making play out of something not meant for that at all. And it's profound. It speaks to the issue of the border wall and of the imprisonment of families at the border. And it does it through a spark of joy, right? This moment of, oh yes, they're playing together. Isn't that cute? Isn't that beautiful? So I want to end on that when thinking about conceptual art. It can go in lots and lots of ways and is a very important emotional and political tool.